Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I want to go over midterm 1, the first midterm we took in class in Principles of Micro. And this basically looked at supply and demand, elasticities, negative and positive externalities, taxation, public goods, price controls, a little bit of trade, a little bit of just the basics of economics all together in one pretty heavy first couple of weeks. So I'm going to go through the graphing problems first, and then I'll go through some of the short answer problems and the multiple choice problems with you. So there are multiple versions of the exams, but they should all have basically the same kinds of questions. And they start with looking at the wrong exam. Looking at the graphing problems. There were three main graphing problems here. The first one looked at an externality problem. The second one looked at graphing market demand and market supply. And then the third one looked at welfare and the incidence of taxes and talked a little teensy bit about elasticities. So the first one that we had, I'll pull up so you can see it here on the screen and we'll talk about it. Okay, so this first problem, like I said, deals with externalities. And there were two versions of it. One had the market for education and talked about positive externalities. The other had the market for gasoline and talked about negative externalities. And the big idea here we want to remember is that externalities generate an external cost or benefit outside of the private costs or benefits. So whatever we have the market for will be in price and quantity space, and the graph is already given to you, so that should help make it easier. And we've got some downward sloping demand curve and upward sloping supply curve, right? And we've got an equilibrium, and that's kind of all the information you're given. And what you want to remember with these is that in equilibrium, demand and supply represent the private costs and benefits of buying a good. So demand is going to represent those internal or private benefits. And that's why we buy things, because it gives us some private benefit. Whether it's gasoline or education, we're consuming it because of the benefit it gives us. Firms sell it to us, and the cost they sell it for is based on the internal cost or the private cost associated with that good or service. And that's really the baseline. And then what you need to remember is that these externalities are going to be on top of that in addition. So the first example is the positive externality associated with education. With education, there are private benefits like higher wages, better lifetime outcomes, and those are the, better quality of life. And those are the reasons people go out and get education. But there's also larger social benefits. There's an additional social cost, an external cost. And so the size of that external cost is going to be on top of the internal cost. And so we graph it as a second higher demand curve that is the social benefit. And the social benefit means it's going to include both internal and external benefits. And that's positive externalities. And this is the idea that having educated people makes the population better off, it's better for society. The more education people have, the more businesses they start, the more voting they do, the less crime they do, better citizens, more innovation, all good things that we like. So that's going to mean that the market equilibrium, which is this right here, is going to be smaller than the socially optimal equilibrium. And this is what we went over in class, right? We went over a positive externality as a participation activity together. And so maybe the equilibrium in the market is 30 classes, and the socially optimal level is going to be higher. And I wasn't looking for a number, I was just looking for a higher level. And so then how do we internalize these things? Well, we need to subsidize them to get to this point. We need to impose a subsidy like we do with colleges and community colleges, with state schools, or we can create regulations and create public goods like public K through 12 school and requirements for education before you can do certain jobs or have certain careers. So that's a way that we internalize that externality. So we have graphed the effect of the positive externality. We've indicated that the market equilibrium quantity and market equilibrium price are here. And the new socially optimal quantity is going to be a higher quantity that we want to achieve. We internalize every externality with either taxes, subsidies, or regulations. In this case, it's a positive good, so we want to subsidize it to get more of it. What if it was a negative externality, like gasoline? Well, we would start out with the same exact framework. We still have a market in equilibrium, but in this case, we are not talking about an additional benefit, we're talking about an additional higher cost. And so we can graph that in this way, saying, oh, well, there's an external cost in addition to the private cost. In the case of gasoline, that's going to be things like pollution, right? Gasoline generates pollution. It's going to, using gasoline tends to increase our driving, which means more probability of accidents. All those are bad things for society. So the market is going to not incorporate the total social cost of using gasoline, which again includes both those internal and external costs. So that means that this market equilibrium is too high, and the socially optimal quantity would be a lower quantity of gasoline at a higher price. And so how would we solve this problem? We would tax it or regulate it like we do. We put taxes on gasoline to try and reduce consumption, and we make laws about what kind of gasoline and other fuels can be used and when and where they can be used. And so again, we have our market equilibrium. We have now our lower socially optimal quantity. And we would solve this externality problem with taxes or regulation to try and reduce it, because when it's negative, the market is going to tend to overproduce it. And so we want to just think about these things as being side effects of private decision making. Okay, so far so good. The next question, we got one of our extra credit questions here. What is ceteris paribus? What does ceteris paribus mean? This was a little bit of a weird one, so I didn't think it was worth putting as a multiple choice question, but the big idea here is that ceteris paribus is a common assumption in economic models, and it just means all else held constant or all else the same in Latin. And so we use this in economics because whenever we change something like graphing an externality, we only want to change one thing at a time so that we can isolate the effect of whatever we're looking at. So that question was there. And then this next one says to look at the individual demand and supply and then sum them to get the market for cookies in a small town. So we go through and we sum market demand, and everyone did pretty well on this one. We sum market demand by going through and adding up the individual demands. What's going on here? Oh, it's a PDF, that's why. So we would add up the price at a price of 0, how much the market demands. And so we have Janelle wants 8, Courtney wants 5, Sumi wants 4. So that's going to give us a market demand of 17. And then we just keep going and adding up along those lines so that we end up with a market demand and a market supply schedule that looks like this. And I'm going to put price here, and I'll put demand here, and supply here, and I'll just put the totals in. So we start out with $0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And I tried to keep it simple so you didn't have to do a ton of graphing. So when we add up, we see that Janelle wants 8, Courtney wants 5, Sumi wants 4, so that gives us a market demand of 17 cookies at a price of $1. Quantity demanded is going to go down for each individual, giving us a lower market demand. So in this case, it's 6 plus 4 plus 3, or 13. Then 4 plus 3 plus 2, which is going to give us 9. And then at $3, it's 2 plus 2 plus 1, which is 5. And then at $4, only Janelle and Courtney each want 1 cookie, giving us 2. On the supply side, we have 2 firms. At $0, they'll supply 0 cookies. At $1, they'll supply a total of 3. At $2, Toll House supplies 4, Girl Scouts supply 5, so that's a total of 9. And then we get 13 and 18. And we can see already our equilibrium here is going to be at $2 because that's where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. Now we want to go ahead and use this supply and demand schedule to graph. And again, I tried to keep the numbers nice and simple. And this problem is the same on both versions of the exam, so you should all have had the same problem at this point. And then we have quantities of, let's say, 2, 4, 6, 8, 12, 14, 16, and 18. And then we can go through and graph these curves. So supply, I'll start with demand at a price of 0. The quantity demanded is 17. At a price of $1, the quantity demanded is 13. A price of $2, quantity demanded is 9. At a price of $3, quantity demanded is 5. And at a price of $4, quantity demanded is 2. So that's our demand curve. And then our supply curve is going to be graphed upward sloping, starting with 0, 0, and then at $1 and 3 cookies, and then $2 and 9 cookies, and then $3 and 13 cookies, and then $4 and 18 cookies. So that's our supply curve. And you don't have to be super precious about this. The idea is to get the gist of it. You do want to have your equilibrium be pretty close to spot on, which worked out for me. And if not, you can always just say, hey, yeah, my equilibrium price is $2 and my equilibrium quantity is 9 cookies. So far, so good. Part C is different depending on your version of the exam. If you had one version, then the change in the market is going to be an increase in consumer income. The other version of the exam had an increase in input prices. And I'll do the input prices first because I did the other version first last time. So in input prices, both of these are non-price determinants. So they're both going to have the effect of shifting a curve. So what you have to figure out is, okay, which curve shifts and which direction, and then find the new equilibrium. For an increase in input prices, that's going to affect the supply side. It's going to make producing cookies more expensive. So we're going to expect a new supply curve up here. We can call that supply 2. We're going to expect a higher price and a lower quantity. So we would shift supply in, we'd see prices go up and quantity demanded go down. Easy peasy. For consumer income, that's not going to be a supply side, that's going to be demand side. We're going to see consumer income is going to tend to increase the quantity demanded at every price, meaning we're going to shift demand out. So that's going to mean that we shift demand out and we see both price and quantity go up in this example, because now at this higher price, with more money, consumers are willing and able to buy more cookies. So far, so good. Hopefully that makes sense. The next big graphing problem was this one, and people had a really hard time with this one. A lot of people struggled with this one, so we'll go over it again. And this is getting back to two big concepts that we did together, which were consumer welfare and the welfare associated with markets, and how we deal with taxes and what the effects of taxes are. So I'm going to try and replicate this graph to the best of my ability up here, and then maybe we'll look at it on the paper too. But we have price and quantity, and this is the market for jewelry. And we have a downward sloping demand curve. And an upward sloping supply curve. And then again, there were two versions of this exam, and so the numbers will be slightly different depending on which version you had. The prices were the same, but the quantities were different. So everyone had an equilibrium price of 500, and then there were two versions. There was an equilibrium quantity of 100 and an equilibrium quantity of 200 that you see there on the exam over there. And so that was the big difference between the two versions. So if you had the 100 version, then it would have looked like this graph here. And if you had the 200 version, it would look like the graph showing up behind me. The calculations are slightly different, but the intuition's the same, and all the questions are the same. So we start out asking for the equilibrium price and quantity. In this case, the equilibrium price is $50, and the equilibrium quantity is 100. Over here, the equilibrium price is $50, but the equilibrium quantity is 200. So far, so good? Okay, so we've got our equilibria in both cases. This would be price equals 200, and then we want to calculate consumer surplus and producer surplus. And like I said, I gave you the equation for it, the area of a triangle, which is 1/2 of base times height, but they're going to have different triangles. So the version here with this triangle, or with this graph that has quantities of 100 and 200 is going to have an area of consumer surplus, which is beneath the demand curve and above the price line, but it's going to be a different triangle depending on what your quantity is. So I'll put it up here. Can you guys see that? Or I can put it down here. Without tax, the consumer surplus for this graph is going to have a triangle with the area of 1/2 of 100 times 50, because it's going from $100 to $50, right? So this is a $50 price and a $100 quantity. So without tax, the consumer surplus is 100 times 50, 1/2 of 100 times 50, which is going to give us a consumer surplus, ooh, there it goes, of 1/2 of 5,000 or 2,500. In this graph over here, we're going to get the same-ish situation, but we're going to have a triangle with a height of $50 and a base of $200. So in that case, this is going to be a triangle with an area of, let's add text, 50 times 200 times 0.5, or consumer surplus equals 5,000. That doesn't quite work for me. Let's see if we can make that work so it's visual for you guys. There we go. That's slightly better. That kind of works. So far, so good. Producer surplus is going to be the other side. Producer surplus is going to be another triangle, but now this triangle is going to be the difference between price and willingness to sell I'm going to go ahead and flip this bad boy. Oops, wrong way. I'm doing everything great today. There we go. So that's going to be our producer surplus triangle, and our producer surplus is going to have the same dimensions because it's still $50, 0 to 50 and 0 to 200. So in this case, our producer surplus is going to be 1/2 of 50 times 200, or 5,000. Again. Okay, oops. What do we do there? I don't know why it's down there, but I can't control that today. Okay, so over here it's going to be a similar story. We're going to be looking at this producer surplus, difference between the price and willingness to sell, except for this triangle. Producer surplus is going to be 1/2 of a triangle with a base of 100 pieces of jewelry and a price of $50, giving us 2,500. Total welfare is going to be 2,500 plus 2,500, or the size of this larger triangle. Now we want to impose a tax. We're going to see a new tax associated with this jewelry, and it's going to tell us that the consumers are going to be paying a portion of it, the producers are going to be paying a portion of it. That's going to be determined by elasticities, but we know it's going to be a $50 tax. And I tried to make it really obvious here by putting in a $50 marking, right? So if you look at this graph, if we go in here and say, okay, what's the difference? What's a $50 difference between consumers and producers? That would be right here. That's this rectangle. This rectangle represents the space between consumers and producers, in the sense that it takes this equilibrium price and raises the price to buyers, lowers the price to sellers until we get a space of $50 between it. We can look at it over here too. I want to see, going from this equilibrium price of $50, I want to move in both directions until I get to $50. And that's right here when we cut the quantity in half and generate our tax revenue. So we're going to have a new quantity and a new price that buyers face and a new price that sellers face. So this is our quantity with tax, and then this is the price sellers receive, and this is the price buyers get. And this is just like we did in class together, right? The tax drives a wedge between consumers and producers, and the government's going to get $50 because every time a piece of jewelry is sold, sellers get 25 bucks, buyers pay 75 bucks. 75 minus 25 is 50, so $50 goes to the government in the form of tax revenue. So with the tax, in this example, we have a tax revenue which is $50 per piece of jewelry, times, in this case, only 50 pieces of jewelry are being bought and sold in this new marketplace. So our new tax revenue is going to be 50 times 50, or $2,500. In this example, the new tax revenue is going to be, still $50 because the tax is still $50, but now we're going to be multiplying it by 100 pieces of jewelry because that's our new quantity down here. And so it's going to be a tax revenue of $5,000. Our new equilibrium here is going to be a quantity of 100. The price to sellers is $25, and the price to buyers is $75. Does that make sense? because otherwise we need to find those $50, right? Before, consumers and producers were both paying and receiving $50. We had an equilibrium. There was no tax. When the government says they want $50 for everything, every transaction that happens, it has to come from somewhere. And so it's not just that consumers pay more, it's also that sellers get less. And the difference between the price that consumers pay and the price that sellers get is that $50. So now I go into a jewelry store, and before I bought a watch for $50, and the jewelry store took the $50. Now I go into the jewelry store, I pay $75, the store keeps $25, and $50 goes to the government. But not just for me, that happens 100 times or 50 times. And that means that half as many people are going to be buying jewelry, because that's a really big tax, right? Relative to the price, right? Prices have gone up by half. So that's our tax revenue. Oops, that's not how you spell tax. And then we want to calculate our consumer surplus, producer surplus, and deadweight loss. So in this case, I'm going to change this color because we want to make sure that deadweight loss gets to be red, because we hate deadweight loss. Let's see if we can't make this pink so it matches. That'll do. Okay. So now we have a new smaller consumer surplus. I'm going to put a new triangle in there to show that. It's going to be right here. And let's make it green. Let's make it this color. There we go. I can also do it over here. My new smaller consumer surplus is still willingness to pay minus price. It's just that price went up. So the new consumer surplus, you won't be able to see this color, is going to be a triangle with an area of 1/2 base of 50 pieces of jewelry, height of $25. Or a consumer surplus of actually just $625. Oops. Some people got a little bit mixed up on the math on this one. I didn't ding you for that if you showed me the equation and the equation was right. Producer surplus is going to be the same. We're going to see producer surplus be smaller. We'll say that producer surplus is still that area between price and willingness to sell, but it's going to be a base of 50 pieces of jewelry and a height of $25. And so we see that this is symmetrical. And so these numbers are the same. And we also see that the incidence of the tax is the same because the slope of these two graphs, these two curves, is the same. In this example over here, we have a consumer surplus, which is equal to 1/2 of a base. And the new base of this triangle is 100, and the height is 25. So 100 times 25, which is going to give us 1/2 times 2,500, or 1,250. Producer surplus is going to be the same, because they're symmetrical, oops, but also because if you look at this triangle, we can see producer surplus down here has a base of 100 pieces of jewelry and a height of $25. So sellers are still getting less than they would have before, but they're still not totally terribly off. The tax revenue is this rectangle here, and then finally we have the deadweight loss triangle. And the deadweight loss triangle did seem to kind of throw some folks off. So we're going to try and draw that guy right here. Let's put him right there and then turn him around. Boop, boop, boop. It's more like that. Okay, so the deadweight loss triangle is the area of all the economic activity that didn't happen. And so this is going to be the people who would have bought jewelry but now can't afford it because it got more expensive, and the firms that would have sold jewelry, but when prices went from when they used to take home $50, now they only take home $25. These firms couldn't participate, these sellers could, or these consumers couldn't participate, and so the deadweight loss triangle is all this lost economic activity. That's our deadweight loss. Our deadweight loss is also a triangle, even though it's a different shaped triangle, and it's the size of the tax and the lost economic activity. So it's going to be 50 times 50 in this case. So 1/2 of 50 times 50 is 1/2 of 2,500, or 1,250. In this example, the deadweight loss triangle is going to be another triangle. So it's going to be, one half of a $50 tax times 100 pieces of jewelry lost, which is going to give us 1/2 times 5,000, or $2,500 in deadweight loss. So far, so good. Does that kind of make sense? Hopefully it does. We can replicate this guy down here to be our, our producer surplus right down here beneath the new price and above the supply curve. And then the last question asks about the incidence of the tax. Who bears the incidence, and what does this imply about elasticities? And I tried to grade this pretty gently because I feel like people were a little bit surprised by this question. But the big idea here is who's paying the tax. It's a $50 tax. Consumers saw their price go up by $25. And producers saw their price go down by $25. So they're both losing by the same amount. So the incidence is actually split evenly. They both share the incidence of the tax, which tells us that the elasticities are the same. Maybe this is realistic, maybe it's not. Some people had really good arguments about how jewelry is a luxury, so consumers should be really elastic and shouldn't pay the tax. It's up to you what you thought, but I tried to accept answers that were based in economic logic. If you want to talk about it more with me, I'm more than happy to. But that's what I was looking for, is this idea that, listen, the incidence of the tax is split evenly between consumers and producers, have the same relative elasticities. Sound good? Make sense? Going back to the beginning, the other two extra credit questions, how does time affect elasticities? It increases them. The longer anyone has, the more likely they are to adjust. Income elasticity, the longer you have that you have lost money or gained money, the more you're going to respond to that. Consumers are going to respond to prices more over time. We might not respond a lot today, depending on what we're talking about, but over time we'll be more and more responsive. Producers, same. Producers take time to respond to consumers, but the more time they have, the more responsive they can be to a change in price. Cross-price elasticities, any elasticity, we're going to see responses become more elastic, more responsive, more sensitive over time, because adjustment takes time. And the more time we have, the more we can adjust. Comparative advantage. The short answer is just opportunity cost. We determine comparative advantage based on who has the lowest opportunity cost. There were some really creative, really thoughtful, long written answers. I read all of them. I thought some of them were really interesting. Tried to give points when I thought there was good econ in there. But overall, that was what I was looking for, is comparative advantage is determined by who has the lowest opportunity cost. We only really talked about it in week 1, a little bit maybe in week 2, and so I didn't feel like it was worth a real question, but worth some extra credit points if you had that locked away in your head. Other questions that people had a problem with. This question was written incorrectly. I asked about the market for soybeans. The equilibrium price here is $4. And the equilibrium quantity is 500, so that was the right answer. And then in terms of a binding price ceiling is going to be a price below equilibrium. Remember, a binding ceiling is going to be too low. And then what I wanted to ask was, what happens if you impose a price ceiling of $2? Well, you would have a shortage of $4.50, not a surplus. So that was the mistake there. Everybody got points for that one because it was wrong on both versions, and it was too complicated for me to update you all. If the government imposes a price ceiling of $6, that would have no effect on the market. But again, I had a typo in there, and so I just gave everybody points. So everyone got at least 4 points right on the multiple choice problems. Production possibilities frontier right here. These points are possible and efficient. This point is possible but inefficient. We expect life-saving medicine to have a very low price elasticity of demand, really inelastic. You should produce if you have a comparative advantage. This one gave some people some trouble. So the equilibrium wage in this case is $3. A binding price floor would be any floor above $3. And then a minimum wage set at wage 2 would have no effect on the market. Okay? Other than that, that was the majority of it. Let me know what questions you had about the exam, what other questions you had. Some of these things I thought were pretty slam dunk, easy questions. Some of them were a little bit harder. And I tried to mix it up and give everybody an opportunity to get some points. So let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.